Greetings and welcome. I want to play a
Sorry about that. Alright, let's get started. And welcome back. We have a 2009 Acura TSX and we're going to get the front brakes done. Now I'm going to be using an impact gun to get the wheels off. If you don't have one, make sure you loosen your lug nuts before you start to lift up your car with your floor jack. As you can see, I'm lifting up in the center here, and this is the main subframe. It's a strong and safe place to lift up the car from. And as you can see, I'm using jack stands. Always use jack stand. You do not want to rely on a floor jack because they're not safe at all. After you have your car secure on jack stands, you want to chalk off the rear wheels so the car doesn't roll on you, and it's a good idea also to pull your emergency brake. I'm working on the passenger side or the right side of the car. So to make things easier, you want to get inside of the car and turn your steering wheel all the way to the right, and it's going to give you better access to the caliper so you can get to the bolts behind it. There's two fasteners holding on the caliper to the caliper bracket, but we only want to remove the lower fastener. That way we can kind of pivot the caliper upward to get access to the brake pads. I'm using a small prying tool, but you could also use a screwdriver to just pry against the rotor, and you could see the caliper actually move forward. What I'm doing is compressing the piston inside of the caliper, and now it's not as tight and we could actually pull the caliper up, but we don't have the slack that we need because of the brake hose. So we're gonna have to remove this extra fastener right here, and it'll give us that slack that we need to pivot the caliper upward. Now we have great access to the brake pads, but first we have to remove these sort of spring clips. Their job is to kind of separate the pads away from the rotor. So make sure you put those aside. Do not lose them if you don't have replacements. Now if you're just changing your brake pads and you're not changing out the rotors, this is pretty much as far as you have to go. You may have to do a little bit of cleaning to get any rust and dirt off, but for the most part this is as far as you have to go if you're just replacing your brake pads. Now the other bolt that's on the top of the caliper, we're going to leave that one attached, and we're just going to pull back on this rubber boot, and the whole slide pin can just slide right out, and that way we don't have to mess with that bolt. Whether you're replacing just your brake pads or the pads and the rotor, you still have to compress the piston on the caliper. So this tool right here works great. It's very inexpensive and you could get it almost anywhere. I'm using this very simple tool to hold up the caliper. I'm just going to hang it right here off of the spring, and the other end is going to hold the caliper. You do not need this special tool. You could easily use a string, a wire, pretty much anything. You just don't want the caliper hanging off of the brake hose because you could damage the brake hose. The fasteners that hold on the caliper bracket are usually on here pretty tight, so make sure you have an extra long ratchet or a breaker bar to remove them.
Bill, if you'll come with me, you'll float too. You'll float too. You'll float too. You'll float too. You'll float too.
Now it's time to remove the two Phillips screws that hold down the rotor. Sometimes they don't want to come off. This side came off pretty easy, but when I was doing the other side, I did have to use an impact screwdriver, which looks like this, and it'll make the job much easier. After you pull your rotor off, if you see a lot of dirt, grime, or rust on the hub right here, make sure you clean it off with some sort of wire brush. It's very important that this surface is nice, clean, and flat for the new rotor to sit flat on it. I'm going to apply a very thin layer of anti-seize, and it's just to prevent any type of corrosion or sticking the rotor from sticking in the future. Now these are zinc plated rotors, and that's basically just to prevent them from rusting and just looking nice on the car overall. But I don't think you have to clean them because I don't think they have any oil on them. But any other normal rotor, you have to clean them, and I'm still going to go ahead and demonstrate that here. So you want to use brake parts cleaner or soap and water. It works just as well. I use it all the time, and in fact I'm using it here. So just make sure you clean off both sides of the rotor. Anywhere where the brake pads are going to make contact with the rotor, you want to clean that surface. Because these rotors have Phillips screws to hold them in place, they only go on one way, so make sure you keep that in mind when you're reinstalling them so that the bolt holes line up. And now it's time to clean off the caliper bracket. It's a step that's overlooked by most people, but it plays a very important role on how freely the brake pads are going to move. So here I am using a wire brush and even a file. Now with the file, I'm not trying to take any metal off of the bracket itself. I'm just using it to take the rust off. You want this surface as clean and as flat as possible. You may have noticed that we're reusing the old hardware kit, which is basically those little metal shims that the brake pads ride back and forth on. It's because the new brake pads that we have did not come with the new shims, so ideally you would want to replace these things, but it's all we have to work with today, so we're gonna have to reuse them for now. I'm using a little bit of blue thread locker on all of the fasteners that I remove. You don't have to do this, it's just a personal preference of mine. I just like to see it as a little bit of extra security. And of course, we're going to torque everything down to spec. These are the brake components on your car, so you definitely do not want to take a gamble on this. So just do it right the first time and be safe about it. Now this slide pin is a little bit stuck. It doesn't really want to move as freely as it should. So that's a good sign that you should pull it out, clean off the old grease, and apply a fresh coat of grease. You want these pins to be sliding back and forth as freely as they can, and they play a big role on how your brake system or how your brake pads and rotors are going to wear down. And now that this one is all done, we could move on to the other one, which is still attached to the caliper. So we're just going to go through the same exact process. We're just going to clean off the old grease, apply a fresh coat, and make sure it moves freely inside of the caliper bracket. And now it's time to install the new brake pads, but I did notice a difference in them. You see the little hole that's drilled right at the edges of the old brake pads? If you notice, the new brake pads don't have those same holes, and that's basically for those spring clip things that we took off earlier. So unfortunately, we're not going to be able to use them in this application with these brake pads. I'm not sure what's going on with that. You would think that they're designed for this specific car. They should have the provisions for it, but they just don't have the drilled holes, so we can't use those little spring clips on them. And as you can see how easy the brake pads just slid right into place, and that's how it should be. You shouldn't have to use any tools or any type of force to get your brake pads on. They should just slide in. Now you could go ahead and lower your caliper, and you could reinstall the bolt. And once again, I'm going to use a little bit of thread locker on this fastener as well. With the caliper all buttoned up, now we could go ahead and reinstall this bracket that holds the brake hose in place. There's no specific torque for this thing, just get it nice and snug, but don't go crazy with it. Once you've tightened all of your lug nuts down to spec, you want to get in the car and push the brake pedal a few times just to get pressure back to make sure your brakes are going to work before you turn the car on. And that's pretty much it on how to get your front brakes done. The video was a lot of work, so I really hope you liked it. If you did, give it a thumbs up, maybe even share the video. And if you're considering subscribing, don't forget to hit that notification bell. And like always, thanks for watching.